Passionate, driven, enthusiastic, euphoric. This is who we are as entrepreneurs. But how we leverage these incredible attributes to dream and build businesses that scale and grow is what this podcast is all about. Hello, I'm attorneypreneur Josh Brown, and welcome to Franchise Euphoria. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Franchise Euphoria. Josh Brown here. Thrilled to be back. I have been absolutely swamped of late, so I apologize for the somewhat inconsistency of new releases. I try to do one each and every week, but sometimes the whole work thing gets in the way. So I guess that's both a good and bad thing. What I want to talk about this week on Franchise Euphoria is something that is a very, very important consideration when you buy a franchise that virtually nobody thinks of. And that is, what happens if you're too successful? So think about that for a minute. Most people who approach businesses or approach a franchise process are always coming at it from the perspective of what happens if I fail. Very few people approach it from the perspective of what happens if I'm too successful? What are the implications of being too successful? Now, on the one hand, you might be thinking to yourself right about now, ooh, I'd love to have that kind of problem. But would you really? Let me explain. In franchising, as we know, you are locking yourself into a long-term agreement with another business, with the franchisor, and in exchange for paying fees and royalties, and you're going to follow their system and you're going to have to play by their rules. Now, we know you're an independent business, or you're supposed to be an independent operation, but you are tied into that franchise relationship. We also know that the document that you sign is a big, long, stinking legal document that has a bunch of legal mumbo jumbo in it, which is very, very important. So don't misunderstand my legal mumbo jumbo for me saying it's not important. That is what courts are going to look to when they're interpreting your agreement if you run into a situation with the franchise. Well, one of the things I've seen a lot lately is where franchisees become very, very successful. And rather than the franchisor being happy about that success, they start looking at ways in which they can now take over that location. In other words, they can turn it into a corporate-owned location as opposed to a franchisee-owned location. Well, why they would want to do that, I think, is fairly obvious. If, on the one hand, they're getting 5 or 7% royalties, if your location is very, very successful, they're going to be looking at the opportunity from the perspective of, why are we just getting 5 or 7%? If we can own that store ourselves, we can get all of the money associated with it. And it's really becoming a common, or I should say a more common issue in the franchise space, in particular in the retail franchise space with restaurants and so forth, where when franchisors will hone in and see that one particular location is doing exceedingly well as compared to other locations, sometimes they will try to find ways in which they can essentially kick you out of the franchise system and take over the franchise. Now, that sounds absolutely horrible. It sounds deceptive. It sounds coercive. And you know what? It absolutely is. Don't be naive. Don't be mistaken to think that franchisors don't think that way. A lot of them do. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. There is a fair amount of litigation that occurs because of a franchise terminating a franchise relationship, when really what they're trying to do, they're terminating not for any cause. Sure, they're going to say that there's a particular cause for why they're terminating, but in reality, they're terminating so that they can take over that location and turn it into a corporate-owned store. Again, this is something that very, very few people think about when they buy a franchise. And quite frankly, it's something that most franchise owners don't think about through the course of owning a franchise. I mean, after all, the idea behind franchising is that the franchisor is going to provide you with not only the system and the brand, but with some resources and training. And the whole purpose is that you are successful. And so as you continue to amass success, you would think that that would be a good thing, and the franchisor would be quite happy about that. And in certain instances, they are. But one of the things you need to make sure you remember is what happens if you're too successful. So what do you do about it? What happens if this is the case? Well, I think it harkens back to going back to the beginning of your whole franchise search. If you're listening to this and you're considering a franchise, this is one of the many things that you need to factor in as you decide whether or not you want to buy a franchise. You have to think about what happens if I'm too successful. I mean, after all, if you're not buying a franchise system and you go out and start a business on your own, that's one thing you don't have to worry about. If you're too successful, you don't have to worry about somebody else terminating the relationship and trying to take over your business like they can with a franchise. When you do it on your own, you have to worry about how you manage the growth, how you account for that, and how you put yourself in a position to take advantage of it. But you certainly don't have to deal with those kind of situations. This is, again, just one of many things that I think differentiates a franchise system from just a regular business. So here's some things you can do on the front end to help avoid, or at least have an idea if this is the kind of franchise that has either done this kind of thing to other franchisees in the past, or may be in a position to where they would look to do it. The first thing you want to look at is you want to find out how many corporate owned stores the franchise actually has. In a lot of franchise systems, they have traditional franchisee owned and operated locations where they go out, or a area developer goes out and finds other franchisees who are separate from the business, and they own and operate the franchise. But often is the case that a franchisor will have their own corporate owned locations. It'll be owned under a different business, a different underlying name, but it'll be the same owners or the same ownership group as the overall franchisor. It's important when you're looking at a franchise to know and to pay attention to how many of these such businesses exist. What percentage of the franchise stores or locations are corporately owned? Additionally, what has the percentage done over time? In other words, if at this particular time in the franchise business, there's very few corporate owned stores, but previously there were many, well, that's certainly a question you want to ask about. Why were there many corporate owned stores and now there's less now? It could be that the corporate owned stores weren't managed well, weren't run well. The franchisor could have possibly determined that they can't run and grow their franchise system and also manage corporate stores. But that gives you insight into what at least their strategy was at one point in time. So I would pay attention to that. I would also pay attention to the converse of that, which is if they started out with relatively few corporate owned stores or no corporate owned stores, but now all of a sudden you see an increased percentage, or you see an increased takeover of franchisees. This is something very, very important to pay attention to. You need to figure out why that's happening. I'm not so sure you'll get a straight answer from the franchisor, but this is where you need to rely on your intuition, and you need to do some of your own investigation and due diligence to figure out why, if the franchisor started out with just a few or no corporate owned stores, and now they are increasing their corporate ownership of stores. My hunch is if that's the case, it's because they're sensing the profitability or the excessive profitability of those locations and looking to take those over. And from my perspective, that's a huge red flag in franchising. Again, even if you're right, even if they try to terminate you and they have no basis for terminating you, it is going to be very, very costly to go through a litigation process with the franchisor. The fact of the matter is they are going to have more resources, most likely, than you will. And they will be able to sustain a fight that will be very, very, very costly, especially if you get good, reputable franchise legal counsel, which you always should. So this is really the kind of thing you need to think about before you buy a franchise. The other thing I would have you do is, along with, as you're talking with other franchisees and you're talking with other people who are in the franchise business, is I would talk to them about their thoughts on the issue. Has it ever come up? Has the franchisor ever raised the issue with them? Do they know of any other franchisees who have been approached by the franchisor, or something similar like a corporate takeover has occurred with other franchisees? Again, that's just something where, you want to ask the people with their boots on the ground. You want to ask the franchisees who have been a part of the system for a good period of time, and see what their thoughts are. There's never any harm that can be done by way of asking questions and bending the ear of other franchisees. So, really just this episode wanted to focus on that. I think it really is a little known issue, or a little known reality, I should say, of franchising that very, very few people talk about, but it's still a legitimate concern, because obviously your goal when you get into franchising is you want to be as successful as possible. Of course you want to be as successful as possible. And that's the whole point in starting any kind of business. Well, you just really got to think about what happens when you do become successful. That certainly should impact your decision in getting involved with the franchise to begin with, and should impact your decision on your ultimate end game, how you're going to grow your business, what your ultimate goals are within that franchise system. Well, I hope this was a helpful tip today for you. Again, if you're looking for other helpful tips, I've got a great resource on my website called What to Know Before You Buy a Franchise. It's a free ebook. Feel free to pop over to indyfranchiselaw.com. That's Indy, INDY, franchiselaw.com, and you can find that free resource along with a whole host of other white papers and blogs. I mean, I've got hundreds of blogs and content that I think will be very, very helpful for you if you are a franchise buying prospect at this particular time, or you own a franchise or looking to sell a franchise. So hopefully this all is beneficial for you. Feel free at any time to reach out to me via email as well, josh@indyfranchiselaw.com. Always look forward to hearing from my listeners. And until the next time, happy franchising.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.